Karen's voice cracked across the yard like a screen door in a storm. "Your shed is illegal, Harold. Unsightly and non-compliant." I rounded the gate with my mother's key still warm in my palm and stopped short. Where her cedar shed had stood for 3 decades, the grass was shaved to raw dirt, a scatter of splinters glinting like fish bones. The rectangle smelled of wet wood and old motor oil the way it did when I was a boy helping her sharpen shears on rainy Saturdays. "Karen," I said steady as I could manage what happened here. She hoisted a plastic clipboard the way a choir director lifts a hymnal. Article 7, Section B. Outbuildings must conform to approved materials and setbacks. We issued notice. You failed to respond. The board authorized removal. I arrived yesterday, I said. From Cincinnati. My mother passed in January. This shed came with the house. Not to current standard, she replied already, angling her shoulders toward the onlookers by the mailbox row. One neighbor raised a phone. Another sipped coffee, pretending not to film. The church bulletin board across Maple Street clicked in the breeze, thumbtacks flashing in little suns. I crouched and pinched a curl of cedar from the dirt. It clung to my fingertips, powder memory. A pause. I let the quiet sit there the way radio hosts let an old song finish its last note. Then I reached for my mother's garden trowel still hanging under the back step. The handle carried the shallow groove of her thumb. The metal felt cool and sure. Who authorized the crew, I asked. The board, she said, flipping to a page. Unanimous vote. Show me the permit for demolition. This is private enforcement, she said. No municipal permit required for compliance action. That your opinion, or the law, HOA policy. She tapped a photocopy lined with yellow highlighter. The covenants are clear. I took the paper. The toner smelled faintly burned. This is a photocopy, not a posted notice. We posted on the front door, she said, and mailed. Twice. To whom current occupant she answered smiling for the benefit of the phones. I watched a choir mom tack a potluck sign up to the church board, then looked back at the rectangle where the shed had been. My mother used to say, wood forgives less than people measure twice cut, once apologize if you must. Let's be neighborly, I tried. I'll rebuild the same footprint, better materials, approved color. I'll submit drawings this week. Out of the question, Karen said. You'll submit an application with elevations, color samples, setbacks, and a landscape plan. The Architectural Review Committee may consider it in 60 to 90 days. And in the meantime, you'll live within the standards of our community. The neighbor in the ball cap by the mailboxes called. If the board says it's junk, it's junk. I could have told him about the coffee cans of screws my mother sorted by size, about the rainy April we sanded a bench until it felt like riverstone. Instead, I breathed through my nose, steadying the old ache in my throat. Were dues delinquent? I asked. Special assessment unpaid, she said crisply. Lien pending. I've been settling her affairs, I said. If there's an assessment, I'll review it. Review time is over, she said, lifting the clipboard like a gavel. We followed process. Then the paper will prove it, I said. All of it. She narrowed her eyes. Are you accusing the board of wrongdoing? I'm accusing the board of hurrying. Because the condition was unsightly, she said. We've had complaints. From whom I asked. She glanced toward the phones. Residents. I studied the photocopy. The line about visual harmony read like it had been drafted by someone afraid of color. Who served the notice? Maintenance. What time? Any witness signatures? She blinked once. We don't owe you a cross-examination in your backyard. Maybe not, I said, but I'm owed a yard. My phone buzzed, sharp, insistent. I let it vibrate in my pocket, counting heartbeats, then ignored it. A quiet beat settled the soft crumble of cedar under my shoe, a sparrow strafing the fence, the faint soprano of a choir scale drifting from the church hall. First Tuesday, I said, nodding at the clubhouse beyond the maples. Board meeting. 7 p.m., she said. Will demolition be on the agenda? It's concluded, she replied. We're moving on to what I asked. To standards, she said the word polished smooth from use. I lifted the trowel, the blade winking in the morning light. Standards shouldn't erase history. History doesn't exempt non-compliance, Karen said, and for the benefit of the cameras added, "We all have to do our part. Show me the vote minutes, please. You can request them in writing," she said. I said. "Right now." She exhaled through her nose. "Submit the proper form." "And we're back to paper," I said. "Paper is clarity," she replied. "Paper is also memory," I said, and something in her smile tightened. The neighbor in the ball cap ambled closer. "Harold." "Don't make trouble." "What do you call tearing down what belonged to my mother?" I asked. He shifted, eyes dropping to the dirt. "Cleanup." "Cleanup comes with a broom," I said. "This came with a crew." Karen turned as if to leave. "We're done here. We're documented here," I said, slipping the photocopy into my jacket pocket. "Big difference." My phone buzzed again. I pulled it out this time more to stop the noise than anything. A push notification from the Postal Service app glowed on the screen. The green bar at the top looked too cheerful for what it said. I felt my jaw set, and for a second the yard tilted the way a radio dial slips past a station. "Everything okay?" the ball-cap neighbor asked. I didn't answer. Instead, I rubbed my fingertips together. Soil dust clung to the whorls like gray chalk. I could almost hear my mother. "Don't rush to anger. Write it down. Ask your questions slow. Karen." I said soft enough the phones might miss it. "If you're right, the record will agree with you. If you're wrong, it'll agree with me." She adjusted a stack of papers under the clipboard. "I expect your full cooperation. You'll have my full documentation," I said. Behind us, the church door opened. Someone taped up a flyer for choir robes and hummed a bar of Blessed Assurance. The melody slid across the street like a hand to steady me. I slid the trowel into my back pocket, ridiculous and necessary. Then looked one last time at the empty rectangle, the edges too clean, the inside too raw. "They broke my shed," I said under my breath, but not my resolve. The ball-cap neighbor scoffed. "That's a little dramatic." "It's accurate," I said. He shrugged and drifted toward the mailbox row. Karen finally turned to go, heels tick-ticking along the sidewalk like a metronome for a song I didn't like. My phone buzzed a third time, more insistent than the choir's high note. I glanced down. The subject line stacked itself in block letters impossible to misunderstand. Certified letter delivered. The certified letter sat in my hand like a brick heavier than paper had any right to be. The green sticker screamed across the envelope, "Return receipt requested." I'd seen enough of those at the post office to know they were never good news. My thumb worried the seam while the chatter around me hummed. A woman argued with the clerk about postage. Coins clinked into the soda machine. Behind me, a man chuckled over a tabloid headline. The world rolled along, and I stood still, heart in my throat. I carried the envelope outside into the fall sunlight. Maple leaves drifted down across the parking lot, gathering in the cracks near the curb. I thought about tossing the letter in the blue bin right there, pretending it had never found me. But avoidance never fixed anything, not with the HOA. Back home, I set the envelope on my kitchen table next to my mother's old recipe box. It smelled faintly of cinnamon and grease pencil, a time capsule of Sunday dinners. I pulled out one card, her handwriting curling neat and steady. Chicken casserole, add sour cream last. My finger traced the loop of her C, and for a moment I felt steadied. I slipped the card under the envelope like a talisman, then slit the flap. The letter inside was formal, merciless. Notice of violation. Unauthorized structure demolished. Pursuant to Article 7 of Maplewood Covenants, a fine of $2,500 is assessed. Payment required within 30 days. Failure will result in lien action against the property located at 114 Willow Bend Drive. The words might as well have been a hammer. I whispered to the empty kitchen. They didn't just break the shed. They want to break the house. I sat back staring at the blinds, watching light stripe across the casserole dish left on my counter by Mrs. Whitaker. She'd dropped it off while I was at the post office, a neighborly kindness wrapped in foil. Steam had fogged the wrap. I set the pan down beside the notice casserole and punishment side by side. One fed the body, the other starved the soul. By afternoon, I was back at the post office letter folded in my pocket. Curiosity burned. I asked the clerk, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, "Ever see these notices come through often?" He glanced over the counter, then leaned closer. "They're tightening the plat lines, Harold," he murmured. "Been shifting lot boundaries quiet-like. Folks whisper about it when the line's short." I blinked. "Plat lines. You mean property boundaries?" He tapped the edge of my envelope with one finger. "Boundaries and assessments. Paper's got teeth when it comes stamped with a seal." He straightened before anyone else could hear. That was the mini-cliff my land shrinking by paperwork while I stood powerless. I drove home with the radio off silence pressing heavier than sound. On the passenger seat, the envelope looked smug, green sticker bright in the late light. I reached over, pressed it flat with my hand, and said aloud, "Paper cuts deeper when it carries a seal." My own words echoed in the quiet cab. Back at the house, I slipped the violation notice into a drawer with my mother's recipe card, two kinds of inheritance stacked together. I sat at the table, staring at the wood grain until the dusk crept across. The phone buzzed, suddenly startling me. A text lit the screen. "Maplewood Diner, tomorrow at 8. I blinked at the name, Jack Ramirez. High school buddy, now retired county surveyor. I hadn't seen him in years, but if anyone knew about boundaries and maps, it was Jack. My pulse quickened. The casserole cooled untouched on the counter. The church bulletin still sat pinned to the fridge advertising next week's choir rehearsal. Life went on. But tomorrow, at a chrome-trimmed booth under buzzing fluorescent lights, I might find the first crack in this wall the HOA was building around me. For now, I laid my hand flat on the recipe card again. The ink, the loops, the familiar feel. Soil dust from yesterday's ruin still clung faintly to my skin like memory, refusing to wash away. Silent beat deep as a held breath, and the phone screen glowed steady. Maplewood Diner, tomorrow at 8. The Maplewood Diner smelled of bacon grease and black coffee, the kind of scent that usually meant comfort. But comfort had no place inside me. My storm had followed me here, a low, gray weight that settled between my shoulders as I slid into a cracked vinyl booth. The jukebox hummed faintly in the corner, a tune no one had paid for in years. Neon lights spilled through the window blinds, catching dust motes drifting in lazy swirls. For a second, I let myself watch them, a silent beat that steadied my hands before Jack Ramirez arrived. He showed up in his old county jacket collar flipped against the October chill. Jack looked older, hair silvering, but his eyes were still sharp, surveyor eyes, the kind that measured land in inches but judged men in miles. He dropped into the booth across from me and wrapped his hands around the chipped mug the waitress set down. "Long time, Harold," he said. "I heard about the shed." I nodded. Karen called it illegal. HOA cheered her on. They flattened it while I stood there with nothing but this. I pulled the garden trowel from my coat pocket, set it on the formica like a relic. Prop 1 still intact. Jack's gaze lingered on it. They picked the wrong fight. I laughed, short and bitter. Feels like they picked the right one. They've got the bylaws, the board, the lawyers. I've got an empty lot where my shed used to be. The waitress refilled our cups without asking. Steam curled up, smelling burnt and strong. Jack tore open 2 sugar packets, poured them in slow. "Harold, every fight starts with knowing whether they even had the right to swing. If they tore down your shed, they may have no jurisdiction at all." I froze halfway to lifting my mug. "What do you mean, no jurisdiction?" He leaned in, elbows on the table, voice lowered so only I could hear over the hum of the diner. "I surveyed these plats for 30 years. I know where HOA authority stops and county zoning begins. If your shed sat outside their enforcement zone, what they did wasn't enforcement, it was trespass." The words hit like a mini-cliff. My heart stuttered. I looked down at the napkin Jack had pulled toward him. He started sketching quick strokes of a pen borrowed from the waitress. A rough square for my lot, dotted lines for setbacks, arrows showing where the HOA's boundaries ended. "These aren't official maps," he muttered, "but they match the filings I remember. You see this strip here?" He tapped the napkin. "That's county easement, not HOA. If your shed was inside that, they had no authority. I exhaled slowly, dust dancing in the neon glow above us. Hope edged in where despair had lived. So all this time their gavel might not even reach me. Jack's mouth twisted into a grin. The quiet truth is louder than their gavel. I repeated it under my breath, letting the words steady me like my mother's recipe card had the night before. A viral quote moment, though neither of us called it that. You're telling me I could fight back. I'm telling you it's worth finding out. He tapped the napkin again. HOA power looks absolute because most people don't question it. But bylaws are paper, and paper can be challenged. I folded the napkin carefully, sliding it into my jacket like it was contraband. The trowel clinked against my keys. Symbols of 2 battles, one of soil, one of ink. We sipped our coffee in silence for a while. The diner buzzed around us, the hiss of the griddle, the squeak of the waitress's sneakers, the rustle of the church bulletin board tacked by the register. Life went on. But my storm had shifted ever so slightly. Finally, Jack set his mug down. Meet me at the courthouse archives tomorrow morning. 9 sharp. We'll pull the original plats, the deeds, and the bylaws. If I'm right, they overstepped big. The cliffhanger sat between us heavier than any plate of pancakes. I nodded once firm. Tomorrow, I said. By dawn, a groan shuddered through the street, low and guttural like thunder muffled under the ground. It jolted me awake before the alarm. I pulled on a jacket and stepped into the crisp October air. The sound grew louder, a grinding moan that made the porch railing tremble. Behind Karen's driveway, the earth caved in. One moment, her silver sedan rested on solid asphalt, the next its nose dipped forward, headlights blinking as if in panic. The car slid down into the hole, swallowed inch by inch until only the back bumper and a spinning wheel showed. The sinkhole gaped wider with every heartbeat, coughing up soil and stone. Neighbors rushed out in slippers and robes, clutching steaming mugs. A child clutched a stuffed bear, wide-eyed. From the porch swing across the street, someone lifted a phone to record. The choir mother pressed her hand to her chest, whispering words too soft to hear. Even the man in the ball cap, normally smug, looked shaken. Karen's scream cracked the morning. Sabotage. This is sabotage. Harold's been digging under my driveway, undermining the property lines. Gasps spread through the crowd. Heads swiveling toward me. I hadn't moved from the sidewalk, but in her eyes that was proof enough. I still carried the garden trowel, yesterday's relic, in my jacket pocket, my anchor. I drew it out now without thinking, as if holding it could steady me. But the weld at the base had weakened. With a sudden snap, half the blade clattered onto the pavement. I stared at the jagged stub in my hand. Prop 2 broken, a useless fragment like my shed reduced to splinters. My mother's thumb groove still marked the wooden handle, but even memory couldn't mend the fracture. A hush fell. Only the hiss of shifting earth and the hollow drip of water echoed from the storm drain. A silent beat, the kind that carried weight heavier than words. The air smelled of wet metal, sharp and uneasy. Karen's finger stabbed the air toward me. There you see, he's holding the tool he used. This is his doing. Some neighbors frowned. Others looked away. I raised my palm. I haven't touched your driveway. Look around you. This isn't sabotage. It's neglect. I reached into my jacket again, pulling free the brittle paper Jack and I had uncovered the night before. A permit, edges cracked ink, faded, but legible. Storm drain, maintenance issued 2008. Renewal required every 5 years. The last inspection on record 12 years ago. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. A neighbor pressed her casserole dish onto the porch railing, forgotten as she covered her mouth. The steam curled into the morning air like incense at a funeral. Karen shook her head violently. Irrelevant. The board is responsible for aesthetics and compliance. Infrastructure is none of your concern. Then the board neglected it, I said, voice carrying despite the lump in my throat. I tapped the permit. The paper trembled, but the words were steady. Sometimes the ground tells the truth no judge can deny. The bulletin board at the end of the street flapped in the breeze. Flyers for a choir bake sale. A lost cat the next HOA meeting rattled loose. One tack popped free, clinking on the pavement. A small sound, yet everyone seemed to hear it. The man in the ball cap, Karen's usual defender, muttered, "If the drain was left unchecked." His voice trailed off. He didn't finish. Doubt had caught him. Karen jabbed her clipboard at the crowd. "Don't be fooled. This is about standards, about keeping property values high." A mother pulled her child closer. Another neighbor whispered, "But if the permit's real..." Phones kept recording. The casserole cooled in silence. I held up the broken trowel in one hand, the faded permit in the other two testaments, heritage broken negligence exposed. My voice carried low but clear. This isn't about property values. This is about truth seeping up from the ground itself. Flashing orange lights broke through the crowd. A county truck rumbled up, brakes squealing. An inspector stepped out, reflective vest bright against the morning. Clipboard in one hand, penlight in the other. He walked straight past Karen's protest, knelt by the sinkhole's lip, and shone his light into the void. The drip of water echoed back like a metronome. His expression hardened. He stood tucking the penlight into his vest. For a moment he studied the cracked permit in my hand, then the broken trowel, then Karen still shouting. Finally his eyes settled on me. "Sir," he said, voice steady, official, "we'll need a statement." Every neighbor turned. Phones tilted toward me. Karen's mouth snapped shut for the first time all morning. The weight of the request pressed harder than the broken metal in my palm. Not Karen. Not the board. Me. My turn to speak with the whole street listening. The cliffhanger stretched long as the silence after a hymn. The open house sign on my lawn felt like a stranger had staked a claim to my name. A bright arrow pointed toward my front door as if memory could be toured in 15-minute increments. Balloons bobbed from the stake, cheerful as lies. Across the street, kids had set up a lemonade stand, paper cups, a Sharpie price sign, sticky coins in a shoebox. Farther down, the church parking lot hosted the annual casserole contest, foil pans marching in ranks under hand-lettered labels. Dorothy's Tuna Supreme Chili Mac for a crowd gluten-free mystery. The normalcy of it all made the sign look even more obscene. Karen stood near my porch in a navy blazer speaking to a young realtor who kept smoothing her hair. "Curb appeal is exceptional once you ignore the non-compliant shed debris I've already handled," Karen said, tipping her clipboard so the sun flashed on the metal clip. "We expect multiple offers." I stepped onto the grass, the morning's fresh-cut smell rising around my shoes. For a second, I was a boy again, my father's long stride ahead of me, clippings catching on my socks. He used to mow this same yard in tidy lines and say, "We cut it because we care for it, not because someone's watching." The memory stopped me cold, a silent beat as clean as the edge of a new row. "Karen," I said, keeping my voice level, "you do not have authority to list my mother's house." She didn't turn fully. "Harold, the board, has a duty to ensure properties are brought into compliance and placed in responsible hands when heirs are overwhelmed." Responsible hands. I glanced at the open house flyer taped to my window with blue painter's tape that wasn't mine. "Whose hands are those?" "The market will decide," she said sweetly. The realtor finally faced me. "We're just hosting today's showing, sir. The paperwork is in order." "Show me the paperwork," I said. She looked to Karen, who produced a folder with the efficiency of a magician. Inside were glossy comps, a listing agreement, and a photocopy of HOA minutes, half the page highlighted. I read the line, "Board authorizes caretaker to coordinate sale to prevent further deterioration." No motion, no roll call, just the sentence floating like a raft for wishful thinking. "Caretaker?" I asked. "Who?" Karen lifted her chin. "The board, acting as a caretaker in the community's best interest." "That's not how caretaker works," I said. "And these minutes don't show a vote." The realtor's smile stiffened. Our broker understood authority was clear. "Your broker should read more than the highlights I said." I pulled a manila envelope from my jacket, the one Jack and I had filled at the courthouse archives. "This is the archived deed," I said, sliding the thin, brittle copy from its sleeve. "My mother, Janet Whitaker. Sole owner. No transfer, no power of attorney, no conservatorship. You're attempting to sell a house that isn't yours, and you are doing it with paperwork that amounts to wishful thinking and toner. Karen's smile thinned. The board may file a lien for assessments, which a lien is not a deed. I said, more weary than angry. And it doesn't create a listing. The Lemonade boys whispered to each other, their straws squeaking. The younger one called out free refills for open house. Their father shushed them gently. On the breeze, a ribbon of casserole steam crossed the street from the church lot cheddar and onion and something sweet. Life kept insisting on itself. A couple in matching windbreakers paused at the sign, then at me. "Is the open house still happening?" the woman asked. Karen stepped in smoothly. "Of course. Please sign in." "Wait," I said. "Before you do, you should know the seller doesn't own this home and the board does not have title." The realtor's eyes widened. "Sir, we read the minutes," I said, tapping the thin line of text. "Then look at the deed. Those two documents do not equal consent." She glanced from the paper to Karen and back again. "You assured me." Karen's tone turned syrupy. "Don't be intimidated by theatrics. We're simply preventing blight. I looked at the fresh stripes in the grass and felt my father's absence like a hand pulled away too soon. "This yard is not blight. It's home." My phone buzzed. A text from Jack. "If they're showing, ask for the sign-in sheet. Chain of custody." I pocketed the phone and met the realtor's eyes. "May I see your sign-in sheet? Also, I'll need your broker's name and your office's errors and omissions carrier." The young woman swallowed. "Why? Because." When a listing is fraudulent, I said evenly, "liability travels." She leaned toward me, voice barely a breath. "Fraud rumors? I'm out." She folded her clipboard to her chest like a shield and took a step back. "Minnie Cliff, clean as a cut." Karen's mouth tightened. "You're scaring buyers. I'm informing neighbors," I said. "There's a difference." The windbreakers hesitated, reading the unease in the air the way birds sense an oncoming front. The man said, "We'll come back when you all sort this," and tugged his wife toward the lemonade stand instead. The boys cheered. I held up the deed so the porch cameras could see. "Archived, deed recorded," I said, voice carrying for the phones I knew were watching. "And HOA minutes that don't record an actual vote. They listed my house like a garage sale." The words fell into the quiet and stuck there. The casserole contest PA crackled to life across the street. Judges to the table. "Please," and a gust sent the open house flyer rippling against my window tape, straining. The realtor looked at it as if it were a snake. "Ma'am," I said gently to her, "you don't want to stand under that when it falls." She looked at Karen. "We should pull this. Today." Karen stepped toward the sign, jaw set. "We proceed. The board will not be intimidated by a grieving son's tantrum." "By a grieving son's paperwork," I corrected. "These aren't tantrums, they're records." A small crowd gathered, casserole carriers and aprons, neighbors with lemonade cups sweating in their hands, the man in the ball cap looking more uncertain than I'd ever seen him. I passed the deed to a retired teacher who lived 2 doors down. "Caroline, would you read the owner line for everyone?" She squinted. "Janet Whitaker, sole owner, and the transfer." "None recorded," she said. The realtor exhaled, then lifted the flyer from the window with shaky hands and peeled the painter's tape free. She walked to the stake, slid the open house sign off, and hugged it to her chest. "We're pulling the listing," she said, voice steadying as she spoke. "Effective immediately." A ripple of surprise moved through the crowd. Karen reached for the sign. The realtor stepped back. "Broker's decision," she announced louder. "Listing withdrawn. We apologize for the confusion." Phones tilted. The lemonade boys whooped. Across the street, a church judge rang a small bell for the casserole contest. Normal life and quiet justice overlapped for one humming moment. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The broken trowel in my pocket felt less like a failure and more like a reminder. Some things break to show you where the pressure's been. Karen stared at the empty stake in my lawn fingers flexing around her clipboard. Her smile returned, but it didn't reach her eyes. "This isn't over," she said softly. Maybe it wasn't, but for the first time, a piece of it was. Cliffhanger. The realtor marched to her car, slid the sign into the trunk, and spoke into her phone. Per broker listing is pulled. The words carried over the lawn like a formal notice witnessed by half the block. At the courthouse, the judge's gavel came down with a crack that echoed like a coffin nail against my inheritance. The sound rattled the windows and made the room hold its breath. For one suspended moment, I felt my mother's voice fade with it, her careful notes about dues and bills disappearing beneath the wood. Rows of neighbors sat in folding chairs, their coats still smelling faintly of casserole and fall leaves. Karen, perched in the front row, clipboard balanced on her knees, lips pressed thin as though she had personally carved the judge's bench. The clerk shuffled papers, the bailiff called for silence. I steadied my diner thermos on the table before me, the warm metal grounding me against the cold formality. Beside it lay the storm drain permit, fragile from handling, and the injunction notice we had filed the week before. Artifacts of both truth and survival. The HOA attorney droned, pointing to bylaws printed in bold. The association acted within its rights. The structure was unapproved, the owner delinquent, the board authorized immediate removal. Standard procedure. My lawyer, a local who smelled faintly of coffee and rain, stood with calm resolve. Your Honor, Exhibit A. He lifted the faded permit, the one Jack had helped me find in the archives. Storm drain, maintenance expired for over a decade. The sinkhole that destroyed Ms. Karen's vehicle. That is not my client's doing. It is neglect by the HOA. Gasps rippled from the benches. Karen shifted, but her smile did not falter. The judge tapped his pen against his pad. Proceed. We moved through the evidence like farmers working rows. HOA minutes highlighted without motions. Assessments without signatures. The supposed authority to list my house vanished under scrutiny. When my turn came, I rose, gripping the broken trowel handle in my pocket. I remembered its snap, the way metal gave up under pressure, and how truth had shown clearer in that fracture. I faced the bench. Your Honor, my shed stood 30 years under county code. The board decided convenience was law, and they acted like demolition crews were their hammers. But property rights aren't maintained by convenience. They're maintained by record. The room stilled. The judge adjusted his glasses, then lifted the injunction notice. Mr. Whitaker, this court finds cause to grant a temporary injunction. Until further review, the HOA is barred from altering or listing your property. The gavel came down again. Silent beat the stillness, after sound the breath before relief. For the first time, the balance shifted. But he wasn't done. The judge leaned forward, voice carrying. Furthermore, keys to the lock must be surrendered. Control of the property reverts solely to the recorded heir. HOA board members are to refrain from access pending hearing. The words struck like sunlight through stained glass. A murmur rose mini-cliff, sharp and undeniable. I closed my eyes a moment. My mother's steady hand seemed to rest on mine. Justice had arrived, not in fireworks, not in thunder, but step by careful step. I whispered the truth into the quiet. Justice arrives in quiet increments, not thunder. Karen's pen froze over her clipboard. Her knuckles whitened. Around her neighbors exchanged looks, some nodding, some whispering. The courthouse bulletin board outside the chamber door had advertised pancake breakfasts, choir practice, blood drives, but today it bore witness to a different kind of community notice. The judge adjourned. People stood folding chairs, squealing against the floor. The bailiff gathered exhibits. My lawyer pressed my shoulder, the weight both grounding and freeing. I gathered the thermos, the cracked permit, the injunction copy, sliding them into my folder like relics for safekeeping. As I stepped into the hallway, the light felt warmer. A neighbor patted my back. Another shook my hand. The courthouse air smelled of floor polish and faint coffee. For once, it did not feel hostile. Karen brushed past me close enough for her perfume to mix with dust. She leaned in, her whisper hot against my ear. This isn't over. The words meant as a threat fell instead like a closing curtain on Act 1. The crowd watched us both, sensing the next act would be louder, fuller, and closer to home. The HOA hall smelled of burnt coffee and copier toner, the kind of air that makes tempers short and papers curl. Folding chairs stretched in clumsy rows under buzzing fluorescent lights. A long table up front held a dented microphone, a stack of audit printouts, and a tray of potluck casserole cooling beside a flimsy napkin tower. Through the cinderblock wall, the church choir rehearsed next door, their harmony leaking through like light under a door. Jack stood at my side in his county jacket, pages marked with sticky flags. He nodded once. "You lead," he murmured. "I'll backstop. Mentor re-entry, steady as a survey stake." I placed the broken trowel handle on the table, just the wood, the metal blade long gone, a reminder of what had cracked and where the pressure had come from. Then I set the storm drain permit beside it and fanned the audit printout so the first rows could read the headings: Assessment Ledger Disbursement Summary, Non-Authorized Expenditures. Karen took her seat at the center clipboard stacked like a shield. She smiled without warmth. "We'll begin with regular business," she said into the mic. Then, public comment. A murmur rose. I stepped to the microphone before she could gavel the room into shape. "Tonight isn't regular," I said. "Tonight is about where the money went, who made the decisions, and why a house was listed without title." I lifted the first packet. "You'll find misapplied special assessments payments to a contractor who never renewed a license and a maintenance schedule that expired while our storm drain swallowed a car." Chairs creaked. Someone coughed into a sleeve. The choir loft next door found its pitch and held it pure, unwavering. Karen leaned forward. "Accusations serve no one, Harold. Numbers aren't accusations," I said. "They're testimony in ink." Jack tapped the ledger with a blunt finger. "Line item 47. Emergency beautification $600 to $800. There's no invoice. Line item 62. Community relations $200. Vendor, a PR firm in another county." He looked up at the crowd. "That's not mulch." A wave of whispers swept the room. A woman in the second row flipped a page with a trembling hand. "That's my assessment," she said louder than she meant to. "I skipped groceries for that." From the back, the man in the ball cap rose. His voice punched through the air. "You betrayed us." The word hung there like a thrown stone. A mini cliff trembled across the rows, then the room inhaled as one. Silent beat the collective gasp before any applause, before outrage finds a rhythm. Karen lifted her clipboard. "Let's maintain order." "Order follows trust," I said. "Trust follows truth." I handed the microphone to Caroline, the retired teacher who had read my deed at the open house. "Would you read the non-authorized column totals?" I asked. She steadied her glasses. 23,410, she said. "This spans 2 years. Those funds," I said, "will require restitution or at minimum reclassification and a public vote. Tonight, we propose 3 measures." I held up fingers counting. 1. Suspend authority of the current architectural review process pending audit completion. 2. Independent financial review with results posted in full on the bulletin board and mailed to every address. 3. Refund schedule for improperly collected assessments. Jack leaned into the mic. And 4. Reaffirmation that title actions, including listings, require court-recognized authority, not highlighted minutes. The room loosened, people nodding as if a locked joint had finally clicked back into place. The choir next door swelled into an amen cadence none of us could ignore. Karen spoke into the mic. "These documents are unverified. The board will review on its timeline." Jack lifted a stamped page. "County seal. Verified." A neighbor held up a baby on her hip. "We can't live on your timeline. We live on ours." Another neighbor, the casserole lady, slid the tray from the side table to the center and set a paper plate in front of the microphone as if to anchor the talk to something ordinary. The scent of cheddar and onion steadied the room. I picked up the broken trowel handle. "We've all been told to keep quiet, to let the board handle it." I touched the wood. Silence gave us a sinkhole. Outrage becomes justice when echoed by a crowd. Applause started in the back, uncertain at first, then gathering like rain on a tin roof. The echo filled the low ceiling. 3 seconds of hand claps rolled into a fourth and then a hush as if we'd rehearsed it. Echo, ritual, honest as breath. Karen tried to gavel but hit the block off-center. This is disruptive. Democracy is noisy, Caroline said gently. I slid the motion sheet across the table. We'll take a vote advisory public recorded. Jack handed out clipboards row by row. Pens clicked. Papers rustled. The copier hummed to life for anyone who wanted a copy of the ledger to take home and read at a kitchen table beside a casserole or a thermos. When the pages came back, the tally moved like a tide. Hands up, then hash marks, then totals. I read the numbers into the microphone, careful and slow. Motion 1 passes. Motion 2 passes. Motion 3 passes. Motion 4 passes. The room exhaled. The choir next door let the final chord ring until the cinder blocks seemed to glow. Karen rose, color high in her cheeks. This meeting is adjourned, she declared, not waiting for a vote. She reached for the ring of keys clipped to her belt pool gate storage closet clubhouse office, front sign lighting, and tugged at the clasp. For a second, her hand paused as if the metal weighed more than it ever had. She yanked the ring free. The keys chimed against the tabletop, a small, unmistakable sound that felt larger than the room. Without looking at me, she set them down beside the audit stack. "If you think you can do better," she said, voice wobbling between iron and exhaustion, "then do it." Her chair scraped back. Clipboard tucked tight to her ribs, she turned on her heel and stormed out. The door banged, then settled. No one spoke for a heartbeat. Then the hall found a shared volume, voices low, kind certain. Someone began passing the casserole plates. Jack squeezed my shoulder, a quiet yes in the pressure of his hand. The keys lay there catching fluorescent light. They didn't look like victory. They looked like work finally possible. The new plaque gleamed under the maple tree as if the frost itself were a polished community restored 2022. Someone had tucked cedar boughs around the base, their scent fresh and clean against the cold. The crowd gathered in scarves and knit caps on the clubhouse lawn, breath rising in small ghosts. From the church steps, the choir eased into carols, their harmonies drifting like warm light. On 2 easels near the hot drink table, we'd mounted the audit ledger pages copies for anyone to read, totals circled in plain black ink. No hidden columns, no missing lines. People stopped between sips of cocoa to trace numbers with a gloved finger to nod to say yes. That's where it went, and that's how we fixed it. Nearby, potluck tables sagged with casseroles, green beans under fried onions, sweet potatoes with marshmallows. Something mysterious and delicious bubbling in a borrowed dish. I stood a step from the plaque holding the garden trowel welded, sanded, restored. The handle still bore my mother's thumb groove. The blade shone with a seam of new metal, honest about where it had fractured and how it had been mended. I'd learned to like that seam. The line did not hide the break, it honored what survived it. Jack came up beside me, a wool cap slouched low, the same patient grin he wore at the diner. "Crowd's bigger than the casserole contest," he said. "Better prizes," I said. "No one has to pretend to like raisins." He laughed. "Ready." "As I'll ever be." I stepped to the small podium. The mic clicked. The choir softened. Children on the grass shushed each other. In the hush, the air seemed to chime. I looked out over neighbors who had argued with me, doubted me, stood with me. Their faces were open now, not to a speech, but to something truer than words. "We set out to save a shed," I began. The breath fogging from my mouth in gentle flares, but along the way we repaired something larger. We found out what happens when numbers see daylight and when a community insists on reading them together. I lifted the trowel, the weld catching winter light. This broke because pressure found a weak point. So did we. Then we fixed it out loud in public with help. Inheritance fades, legacy protects. The viral truth sat down in the crowd as if it had been waiting for a chair. Caroline raised a mitten. "Tell them about the ledger she called kind, as always." We posted the audit on the bulletin board and sent copies to every mailbox, I said, gesturing toward the easels. Refunds went out last week. The board, what's left of it, approved the new maintenance schedule. The gate light works. The drains repaired and filed. The clubhouse door actually locks with a key instead of hope. A ripple of laughter. Steam rose from the potluck like a chorus of small benedictions. On the fringe of the crowd, I saw the man in the ball cap holding a paper plate and a quiet, complicated expression. He lifted it in a small salute. I nodded back. We'd learned we didn't have to agree on everything to agree on the ledger. I looked at the plaque again and felt the moment tilt toward private. She left me legacy, I whispered, not into the mic. Not for the phones, just for the frost and the maple bark and my mother who loved a garden more than a grievance. Jack nudged my elbow, a gentle, "Go on." I set the trowel point into a shallow hole we'd dug beneath the tree and pressed the repaired blade into the soil, one clean bite, a ceremonial planting rather than a breaking. My breath fogged, hung, then vanished. Neighbors, I said, this plaque belongs to every person who asked a question, passed a page, tallied a vote, and delivered a casserole when we were too tired to cook. We're not done. Maintenance never ends, but we're together. That's the work and the reward. The choir rose into hark, the herald angels sing. And for a second I thought of the sinkhole sound, the groan that had started the turn. This sound was its opposite, not collapse, but rise. Karen wasn't on the lawn. She hadn't come to the hearing after surrendering the keys, and she hadn't replied to the refund notice we mailed with everyone else's. I hoped the ledger would be lesson enough. I hoped winter would be kind. I took the cloth from the top of the plaque. The brass caught the pale sun and threw it back at us, a warm square on a cold day. People drew closer. The choir held their chord. For a beat, we all just looked. Then Caroline started clapping once, twice, 3 times. The sound rolled through the crowd, swelling into applause that lasted exactly as long as it needed to, and no longer. As it faded, we kept the ritual we'd made at the hall, a brief shared silence, heads bowed, hands still. Echo and quiet are 2-part amen. When the moment let go, neighbors moved like water. Plates appeared. Someone slipped a paper cup of cocoa into my hands. Steam fogged my glasses. A child asked if he could touch the trowel seam, and I knelt so he could see how the metal had mended. "It's stronger because of it," I told him. He nodded solemnly as if I'd revealed a secret about the ground itself. Under the maple, the plaque stood steady. On the table by the easels, a sign read, "Audit Ledger." Please read, please ask. People did. They read. They asked. And they answered each other in full sentences with patience. Jack tapped the mic off and packed it away. "You going to sleep tonight?" he asked. "I might," I said. "First, I'm going to sweep the walk. Then I'll oil the hinges. Then I'll see what the gate light looks like from the porch." He smiled. "Maintenance never ends. That's the point." The carols slipped into a final verse. Someone rang a handbell. The wind moved through the maple, scattering a handful of dry leaves like confetti. I wiped my thumb across the repaired blade. It carried just enough earth to promise spring. We stood together for one last breath, then unveiled our winter and our work to the air. Cliffhanger ceremonial. The cloth fell. The plaque shone. Applause rose and settled, and in the ringing quiet that followed we kept 3 seconds of shared silence, our vow to guard what we'd repaired. The winter sun struck the plaque beneath the maple, and I watched my breath drift like a small flag in the cold. The restored trowel in my hand carried both the scar of its break and the promise of repair, much like our neighborhood after months of hearings and hard questions. What began as outrage over a shed became the ceremony of a community reclaiming its voice, posting ledgers in the open, and sharing casseroles beside them. We discovered that justice isn't thunder. It's steady, the kind that heals old fractures instead of hiding them. Share your HOA story below your map might help someone redraw theirs.